guys are.
Okay, you're live.
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. I've got the midterm exam finished, but I haven't put it up yet because I haven't finished the review. I did set the date as November 1st, so you will have a couple of weeks to do the midterm. And it is actually chapters through 6, or so we're going through soils through quiz 6 rather than going into chapter 7 there. Anyway, getting back to where we left off. Let me get my presentation going here. We were into plant growth and development. I'm going to share my screen. All right, you guys see the PowerPoint there?
There it is.
Okay, so we left off talking about kind of annual and perennial plants and their difference. So let's look at the growth patterns here and how they change. So basically, I mean, it's pretty simple. Annual plant growth for both perennials and annuals. For annuals, it's just going to grow in this pattern here to the left, where it increases in plant height, kind of growing vegetatively until it gets to its reproductive phase, and then it eventually will stop growing in height and just put all that energy into flowers and seed production. Again, I think I can't say it enough that plants want to go to seed. They want to, finish their life cycle. So sometimes they will do drastic things to get to that point. I think a lot of the hemp farmers in our area have had issues with that because they want, for instance, if they're doing a CBD from the flowers, they want to have just female plants. But whenever you try to do that, if it's all females, one of the plants will try to turn into a male in order to, go to seed and get to that reproductive phase. Either way, for annuals, this is what it looks like. For perennials, then you have this cumulative annual growth pattern. Where it kind of does that same thing every year. It goes vegetative until it gets, at least the first few years, until it gets enough energy to where it can get into the reproductive phase. And some perennials will do that in the first year. Some of them, it'll take several years to get to the reproductive phase. So talking about, annuals and perennials, you guys have some ideas of some perennial crops we might grow in agriculture? Somebody throw one out there. Might have to be you, Jay, since I think you're the only one there. Or Richard or Bailey, if you want, or James, I mean, sir. You guys want to speak up there, unmute yourselves. Well, there's lots of potential perennial crops. But most of them, I'm thinking, a lot of them in terms of livestock production, we have almost all perennials. We're growing things like pasture grasses, and those are alfalfa. Those are all perennials. And kind of more like vegetable and fruit production. Most of our commercial fruits, fruit trees are all perennials, woody perennials. But in terms of like an herbaceous perennial crop, we don't have a ton of those in the vegetative world. Asparagus, strawberries, which I guess strawberries are also more of a fruit. They're just an herbaceous plant, but there's some perennial onions out there, but there's not a whole lot when we come to talk about like perennial vegetable production. Anyway, just give that some thought about what crops are annuals versus perennials, and it's very important to consider that when you get into agriculture production. Interesting thing about plants and how they change in their kind of life cycles from juvenility to when they become sexually reproductive. the actual morphology of the plant can change dramatically. So in this case, they have an image here of an acacia tree, um, native to desert areas, and actually sometimes is used kind of as an agricultural plant. Um, when they're young, they have this kind of bipinnate leaf, and when they're old, they get this more linear leaf. So they can change dramatically, and that's important for plant identification. What does it look like when it's young versus what does it look like when it's a little bit older, when it gets into its adult phase? Citrus trees are thorny when they're young, trying to protect themselves, and then when they get older, they tend to kind of reduce that thorniness, or sometimes it disappears altogether. So here's just a chart of some of these morphological characteristics and how they change from um, the juvenile to adult form. So, and just to point out, there's a couple of words on here that you might be like, what the heck does that mean? For these vining plants up here, plagiotropic means that it's kind of growing along the ground, and orthotropic means it's able to start growing up something. So for like English ivy here, heterohelix, it's growing along the ground as a juvenile, but then when it becomes reproductive, it starts growing up like trees, for instance. So anyway, plants change sometimes dramatically, going through these different phases of growth. When we get to the reproductive phase, we're thinking of flowering and then fruit and seed production. And so first it starts with the development of the buds, um, and then opening to flowers, and then becoming pollinated and fertilized, setting fruit, and then the seed maturing. And then the fruits begin to senesce. And that stage of senescence can be very important for us in terms of the harvestable portion of the crop. Is it sometimes it's better to let it senesce a little bit, especially if you're trying to produce, say, a seed crop. So first, let's look at flower induction and initiation, which basically is just where the meristem shifts from being vegetative into reproductive. And they go from just making kind of leaf buds to developing flower buds as well. And for most of our agricultural plants, they are self-inductive. So they will actually just get to a certain size, and then that stimulates them to get to produce flowers. Um, and that is often looked at by how much heat a plant has received over the season. So one measure that we use is growing degree days, which is basically just how the temperature has increased from the low each night as we're moving along. That temperature gets low and somewhat the high temperature too, is the average temperature changing over each day and night. We can use that measure of growing degree days to try to figure out when certain plants will flower and be ready to actually set fruit and sell. They use growing degree days a lot in the agronomic crops like corn and soy. So you can actually find the growing degree days on a lot of the weather service websites. You might have to dig a little bit, but they usually have them recorded. Here's just an example of flower induction and initiation, basically going from a transition of this kind of vegetative meristem to a reproductive one. And this is in a chrysanthemum, first in the bud, but then in the flower. So you can kind of see that in B, starting to develop sort of a flower structure in there. And then in C, it's kind of fully developed. So it just takes time to make that transition. And so many plants are doing that kind of on their own and inducing flowers just as they get an accumulation of heat. But some plants are going to do that in response to the photo period. So as it changes from short days to long days, for instance, then it can induce the flowering of plants. So one way that horticulturists have kind of figured out to kind of change that photo period is by using this night break, which is just a flash of light just for a short period of time to interrupt their night cycle so that the plant thinks that it's getting the long day that it needs to flower, or the short day in some cases. So we can use that night interruption at different times to get flowering crops to flower when we want them to. And a lot of ornamental crops, we use that in greenhouse production in order to basically get them to flower uniformly whenever we want. For chrysanthemums, depending on whether it's a chrysanthemum that is being grown for like cut flowers, they're going to have that, try to have it kind of a regular production. But if you want your chrysanthemums to be ready for autumn, as a pot mum, then they will often start to grow these in the summer, and then they'll force them by you can kind of see it in this picture here, using this blackout cloth, basically to keep or make it think that it's night. Change that photo period so that it will flower early enough to where people can enjoy those before frost kills the flowers. Poinsettias are another example, and generally we try to use them for holidays. And poinsettias are actually it's an interesting story there, how they became the kind of Christmas plant, probably because of the color, the greens and reds that became associated with Santa Claus, right? So anyway, they were native to like the mountains of Mexico, and they were adapted to a particular photo period that they were experiencing there. So in order to get them to produce flowers, we grow them in greenhouses, and basically at the end, or kind of the end of the vegetative cycle, we switch the photo period to get it to initiate the flowers, so that they're ready at Christmas time. So we manipulate photo period in the ornamental horticulture world and controlled environment agriculture, whether it's a greenhouse or a total artificial setting. Can we really do that outdoors? Not very easily. I mean, I guess we could set up some sort of blackout cloth, but there's not really a need to, because most of our agricultural plants do that on their own. We mentioned vernalization, and that being required for biennial plants. Same deal, just getting them to shift from their vegetative state to their reproductive state. And generally, vernalization temperatures are lower. They usually have to go through a period that is lower than this over the winter, but when they actually, in the spring, it needs to warm up and still have a period of days where it's between 32 and 50 in order to get them to actually produce flowers. And I think I also mentioned that for most of our biennial crops, we're not really going for that anyway. We don't care about the flowers. We want the vegetative production for things like beets and Brussels sprouts, carrots. Really, the crop would be ruined if we let it flower. So vernalization is important to know about, and especially looking at certain crops like garlic, for instance, the 40 days under 40 degrees that we have to have so it will develop a head, means that you have to time it just right. I think agriculture really is a lot about timing. especially when we're talking about plants. On just kind of the development of the reproductive phase, we can have an issue where the floral apex itself, that kind of meristem that has become reproductive, it can abort if the environmental conditions are not favorable to actually develop into flowers. And sometimes they'll just continue to grow vegetatively instead of going into that reproductive state. So in this example for poinsettias, again, this image shows a poinsettia that started to kind of get into flowering, but maybe the temperature wasn't right, or maybe that photo period wasn't correct for the long enough time. And so it basically reversed its process, and that meristem reverted back to vegetative production. So everything has to be right in order to make it work. Here's an image of just a simple flower here. And again, just looking at all those flower parts have to be there in order to make fertilization work. They don't necessarily have to be on the same flower. This is a perfect flower here because it's got both male and female parts. There's the female part, the pistil, stigma, and the ovules themselves. And then, of course, the male part is the staminate part, the anther, and the filament, the anther containing the pollen, of course. So we have to have both parts at the right time in order to get pollination of any crop. Other than those that can pollinate without pollen, which, or I guess I should say can be fertilized without pollen, there are a few examples of that out there as well. Exceptions to every rule. So the pollination type itself and the way that it actually develops into fruit depends totally on the biology and the plant's evolution, as well as its co-evolution with other organisms, like the insects that actually bring the pollen to the flowers. So we have self-pollinating plants that produce their fruit and seed with their own pollen. They don't need pollen from another plant. And those plants are often very easy to save pure seed from because of that self-pollination. Then we have cross-pollinating plants, which are also known as selves. They cannot set fruit and seed with their own pollen, so they require it from another plant. And these are the cross-pollinating plants are the ones that are difficult to save seed from because they are usually transferred either by insects or wind, which that pollen can travel sometimes several miles. And why does this happen? Why do certain plants do this? It's somewhat due to the plant's gene pool and its wanting basically to I guess have a diverse set of genes, which makes them more adaptable and thus more survivable. But not all plants need that. And I should say that sometimes we can get cross-pollination with a self-pollinating plant. And that's usually due to an insect or something else kind of messing up the process. Bumblebees are notorious for getting into especially larger bean flowers. To try to get to the nectar, they'll come in and they'll actually open the flower before it's even mature and able to fertilize. And in doing so, they'll put that pollen in there. So when it does become, it's able to receive the pollen, that pollen's already there. So anyway, plants have these incompatibility mechanisms to prevent self-pollination if they are cross-pollinating plants. And basically it won't allow this pollen tube to form. So typically a pollen grain will land on the stigma, and that will send a signal for the flower and the ovaries down here to send up this pollen tube, and it won't grow if it has pollen from itself. There are many organisms that are transferring pollen out there. We usually think of the bees as being very important, and they are, especially for fruit crops. In places like California, Central Valley of California, where they have tons of fruit and nut crops growing, they will actually bring in beehives in order to honey beehives in order to get that pollination to occur. But there are other pollinating agents out there. For aquatic plants, it can be water. We can have snails and slugs, and even birds and bats pollinate as well. Just depends on how that plant co-evolved. So here's what it looks like when it does work. We get that pollen grain landing, and then the pollen tube, it's kind of actually a little bit of both. The pollen and they're kind of working together to form this pollen tube, basically to get that male sex cell into the ovaries, the ovules themselves, so that it can make a fruit. And then all of this tissue here will begin to develop into whatever style of fruit it is. Then there's this whole other phenomenon called parthenocarpy, which is the formation of fruit without pollination or fertilization. And usually in parthenocarpy, we don't actually get seeds being produced because there's no fertilization taking place. So all of our seedless fruits are parthenocarpic. And typically we have to figure out a way to induce that kind of externally. And we mostly do that by the application of some of these different plant growth hormones. In some cases, though, like with seedless grapes, we do have pollination and fertilization occurring and the fruit forms, but then the embryo itself aborts, and therefore there is no viable seed produced. And that's a different phenomenon known as stenospermocarpy. Both of these plants have to have some sort of vegetative propagation in order to keep them alive and keep them going. In some cases, we will actually go in there and induce some type of parthenocarpy or stenospermocarpy in order to develop a more marketable crop, like with seedless watermelons. So with watermelons, it's really a fascinating process, and kind of amazes me that someone was able to figure this out. They will take a variety of watermelon and they'll use this chemical colchicine, which comes from the crocus flower, and that causes that plant to have this phenomenon of tetraploidy, where it has extra sets of chromosomes. And then they take that variety and cross-pollinate it in a controlled environment to a regular diploid variety. So it does get another plant produced. It's producing seed in this case, but the resulting seed is going to produce a triploid plant, which is sterile. So it has 3 sets of chromosomes, and because it's sterile, you've had seedless watermelons before, I'm sure. They do have these kind of aborted seeds in them. They're there, but they're, at the point where you can easily eat them. So they're not truly seedless. It's just the seed doesn't actually mature. So when we have the formation of fruit, we have all these accessory tissues that are involved, and usually that's what we're eating. Like in the watermelon, we're eating kind of this accessory tissue and not the true fruit itself, because the true fruit is just the enlarged ovary, part of the seed coat. So the marketable, harvestable portion of the plant might include that, but we're really eating accessory tissues in a lot of the cases. Also, in many plants, only a small percentage of flowers actually end up developing into fruits, both in the natural world and in an agricultural setting too. Here's just a look at the process of fruit setting, and there's always different time scale, not even just for a different type of plant, but also just for a different variety within a species. They mature at different dates. So the days from pollination to the development of the tissues that are responsible for, I guess, enclosing the seed. That's all the plants really care about, is just making that developed seed. So we intentionally breed them to get more of those accessory tissues in a lot of cases. So the plant hormones themselves can also be involved in setting fruit, but we actually still don't really know exactly how that happens. We'll take a look here at some of these hormones and how it works here in just a second. One of the big problems that we have in the agricultural setting for fruit production is just getting the right level of fruit to where we get the right size of fruit. So if we have too many fruits, then generally we get kind of smaller, less than ideal quality fruits that might mature later. And that's usually what plants will kind of do naturally. If you don't interrupt its kind of reproductive phase, then a lot of times they will just produce tons and tons of fruit and tons of seeds. And that's why plants in nature tend to have these kind of mast cycles, especially nut trees. They'll go sometimes years where they don't produce any fruit, but then all of a sudden they're producing tons, kind of saving up that energy so that they're able to have one big crop. And then because they put all that energy into one big crop, they won't have a large crop for a few years. To overcome that, in an agricultural setting, we will remove, some cases, half or more of the fruits, usually at an early stage, so that the plant doesn't waste energy in trying to develop those fruits. And we've developed some plants that are self-thinning, so they'll drop fruits, especially some varieties of peaches. And it makes sense to me. I mean, if you have less fruits, then they tend to be bigger and of a higher quality. And I think that is probably not the same across the board with every plant, but most of our agricultural plants, if you want to get a big fruit, if you want to grow like a, award-winning pumpkin, for instance, then generally you're going to thin the fruits out just to one per vine. And you're going to treat that pumpkin with the utmost optimal, I guess beyond optimal care, in order to get it to grow very large. Same with watermelons, same with fruit trees, really any crop, any fruiting crop. Thinning the fruit to get more, less, but larger and better quality fruits. All right, so let's take a look at using the different hormonal substances and how the plant hormones, which are naturally occurring in many cases, kind of change it in terms of the marketable crops themselves. So one thing that we see for grapes is that we apply this hormone gibberellin to them at an early stage of development to greatly increase the fruit size. And it'll make sense here in a minute why we do that and how it actually does it. So while the flowers are developing in the early stages of their fruit growth, there is some considerable cell division, but it basically increases to a point where it's a very intense period of cell division where these fruits are increasing in size because of cell enlargement. And there's kind of different patterns of how fruits develop that are, of course, specific to the different species. But this is resulting from basically different hormonal signals from the plants. So here's just a look at the two basic patterns of fruit growth. Kind of a simple growth curve here where they just increase in size kind of in a stable rate until they get to the largest size they can, and they just continue to mature and kind of develop the sugars. Some fruits, and in this case, we're looking at say apples and almonds and peaches and cherries. They're all in the same plant family, but they have different growth patterns. So in this case, we've got like a double curve where basically it's going to increase in size initially, a period of rapid expansion, and then it's going to begin to just mature, develop the sugars, etc. And then it's going to, after it gets to a point to where those sugars are developed, it's going to go to the next stage of expansion. So that's just important to know in terms of managing those fruiting crops. So for the stone fruits, things like peaches, apricots, almonds, you see this kind of double growth. And that is actually, for the stone fruits, we're seeing this additional stage that is developing the pit of the plant, the actual stone in the fruit itself. Some fruits are going to ripen as kind of off the plant. Some ripen only on the plant, and the ones that are able to ripen or continue their ripening process and those chemical changes in them off the plant are called climacteric fruits. And usually this is due to the hormone ethylene, and they release high levels of this gas naturally, basically to continue that ripening. So apples, apricots, bananas, tomatoes are all examples. And generally what we do in order to get these to continue to ripen off the plant is we might even add ethylene. So in a lot of cases, say like with tomatoes, they're picking them off of the plant green, and then they're going to put them in a truck, transport them to a grocery store, and be gassing them with ethylene all the way. So that treatment of this ethylene, either before or after the harvest, continues that process of ripening. And that can also, if you have extra ethylene, it can also do some harm to ethylene sensitive plants that could be nearby. We had an issue with this when we had our floral design class. They would store these flowers in our cooler. We had a particular flower cooler in the greenhouse, or in the tool shed anyway, and our greenhouse manager at the time would also put lunch in there, and if it was producing ethylene, it would cause the flowers to continue ripening and drop their petals. All right, so going from fruit production to the next stage of life for plants, which is basically a long process of death, which we look at as senescence. There's all kinds of different life cycles, or lifespans, I should say, of plants out there, ranging from trees like the Methuselah, which is, I guess, supposedly one of the oldest trees on the planet. They've found to be well over 3,000 years old, to olive trees in the Mediterranean that were planted that are believed to be 2,000 years old. Of course, the annual plants that only live a year. So senescence is just this irreversible change in the living organisms, that the cells and tissues begin to break down, before the plant dies, or really any organism. It's kind of the same across the board. Tissue begins to break down. But we actually might use some vegetative propagation as a way to extend the life of a plant. And theoretically, it could be indefinitely. So one of the cases for that is like bonsai trees. Um, we had a guy nearby who used to be the curator for the Washington, D.C. collection of bonsai, the U.S. collection, because a lot of the Asian countries would give us these ancient bonsai trees as gifts for whatever reason, diplomatic events, diplomatic exchanges. And so they would say that some of those are thousands of years old, that they took these cuttings from these old trees and basically kept them in before it reached that senescent cycle. So there are several examples out there of that. And I mean, some of the apples, like the winter pearmain apple, which was cultivated in England, they have grown there, as early as, 1200 AD. So, hundreds of years we've been growing that one variety that came from one plant originally. It's kind of cool what we can do with plants. We can also have senescence not just due to the natural lifespan of the plant, but due to the attack of pathogens or pests, or just environmental stresses too. It's also important to note that senescence is not just the degradation of the plant. There are some things that can be good. So some particular message RNAs and proteins are synthesized only in senescing tissues. So sometimes we want to get the plant into senescence so it produces a certain chemical or a certain product. We can hasten senescence by transferring stored nutrients to the reproductive parts of the plant. And there's several things that we can do to kind of initiate that. One of the most simple things is to pick off flowers or fruits before seeds start to form, because once they finish producing the amount of seeds they think they need to produce, they will stop. So things like cucumbers, squash, if we keep picking them, then they'll keep producing immature fruit. So it's really important for summer squash. But if we let fruits get to maturity, then they'll stop and begin to senesce. All right, let's talk about hormones, which are also called plant growth regulators, when we're using them kind of to get a particular goal. So the plant hormone itself is a natural substance produced by the plant, and the plant growth regulator, which can be natural or synthetic. We're actually using these hormones and also some other chemicals to get certain effects on the plant. So we got 5 groups of natural plant hormones: auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins, ethylene, and abscisic acid. So here's just the chemical formulas of them when they're naturally occurring inside the plant, and then how we've figured out how to synthesize them. So auxins, for instance, are our rooting powders, or sometimes liquids too. Gibberellins, we figured out many different ways to make a class of this chemical that can be used to get different effects on plants. There's also some other types as well, some that are natural and some that are not. Just a few different ones out there. So basically, we're using these to manipulate the plant growth and development, and the plant naturally uses them to manipulate its own growth and development. So first, auxins. Auxins are naturally originating in the meristems and the enlarging tissues of the plant, and they cause plants to have that apical dominance. where that meristem is at the top of the plant, and everything is growing laterally outside of those auxins. And what we use them for mostly is for rooting, and we get them to switch, and we kind of change the level of auxin to cytokinin to get them to form adventitious roots so that we can propagate plants or to inhibit vegetative production and tissue culture, which we'll talk about these in more detail later on. But just for now, think of auxins as kind of the rooting powder, but also occurring naturally in the meristems. Gibberellins are a whole class of a bunch of different chemicals that have all kinds of different functions, from stimulating cell division or elongating parts of the plant, especially the stems, to controlling particular enzymes in the plant. And in some cases, it's also involved in the actual sex of the plant. So whether it's a male or female, as well as fruit set and growth. So gibberellins can do a whole lot of different things, but they're mostly used for some sort of growth of the plant. We're not using them to create roots or anything like that. So here's an example in corn of using gibberellin to overcome a genetic mutation of being a dwarf plant. So on the left, we got a dwarf plant. In the center, we got a non-dwarf plant that has been sprayed with gibberellin. And then on the right, we've got what was supposed to be genetically a dwarf, like the one on the left, but was sprayed with gibberellin, which basically just caused it to overcome that. Gibberellins are also involved in overcoming dormancy in and buds, getting them to germinate. Gibberellins were first discovered in 1926 by some Japanese researchers studying a disease of rice, and they found that the plants that are infected with the fungus grew excessively and abnormally. And then they extracted stuff from that fungus and sprayed it onto plants, and somehow figured out that it was this chemical derived from it, and they named it gibberellin after that fungus, Gibberella. One of the most common uses of gibberellins, as we mentioned, is to increase size of grapes. And basically what it does is it increases the space between grapes and the stem elongation itself so that they get larger. So in this case, we've got like a untreated plant, one that had the stem girdled in order to get that gibberellin production. And then both of these are plants that are sprayed with different rates of gibberellins. Almost all of your table grapes that you find in the market used for fresh eating are sprayed with gibberellin to get larger grapes. Here's different levels of gibberellin on germination and growth of grape seedlings. So you add gibberellin, you get more germination too. Some other agricultural uses for them, they can promote male flowers and cucumbers. They can overcome cold requirements for some plants. And in some ornamental plants, they can use them to grow them into different forms. So like more of like a tree form than more of like a bush form. And here's an example of that in poinsettias. We use that gibberellin basically to get it to grow into this tree form for whatever ornamental purpose. The cytokinins are interacting with the auxins to influence the differentiation of plants. So they can do all kinds of different things as well, but it's the ratio of auxin to cytokinin which controls the formation of roots versus shoots. And there's a whole bunch of them out there, over 100 different both naturally occurring and synthetically made cytokinins. Probably the most common use of cytokinin is to basically stimulate the production of different tissues and plants. So we have to get the ratio just right. This is in tissue culture here. So using both auxin and cytokinin at the right stage to get it to form buds and roots, and both in order to get it to basically develop into a new plant just from a few cells. Cytokinins also can indirectly increase enzyme activity and also increase the DNA that's produced in some tissues. And on that note, we're out of time, so we'll save the rest of the hormones for next week. So until then, you guys start working on your crop project and be looking out for the midterm exam review to go up and then the exam itself to open up. All right, well, I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.
Okay, bye.
Cheers.